This is Little Green Cheese, Episode 9. Well, welcome back. This is Little Green Cheese. I'm Gavin Weber, and this podcast is where you can learn about cheese making at home. So, some of the things that have happened around the place over the last few weeks, and I apologise for not making a podcast earlier. I didn't seem to have as many questions as I normally do. So, if you have any cheese making questions, don't hesitate to send them through via email, gavin@littlegreencheese.com. And I haven't been making a lot of cheese, but I've been teaching. So, that's a good thing. So what are we going to be talking about this episode? Well, we're going to be talking about something dear to my heart, and that is milk. We're going to be talking about how milk is not used in the cheese process, but the different types of milk. So let's start off. So one of my favourite types of milk to use is, and this can be from any animal, any milk producing animal, whether it be cow, goat, sheep, buffalo. There's some of the main ones. Yaks, but no yaks around here. So one of my first favourite ones is raw milk. So raw milk is basically straight from the cow. It's more common for people who have their own house cow. It's illegal for farmers to sell raw milk direct to the public here in Australia. There are different laws in the States, but the main overarching one is from Food Standards Australia and New Zealand, and they prohibit the making of cheese for sale if it is made from raw milk. There's one caveat though, of course, that if the cheese is cooked at a high enough temperature during its process, I think it has to be over 48 degrees Celsius, and then matured for, I think it's over 6 months, but over 6 months, and that obviously increases the acidity and kills any bacteria that may be present in the raw milk. But using raw milk is really, if you've got a goat or a cow at home, is one of the best ways to capture the essence of the milk. In places in Europe, France, Spain, Italy, they make raw milk cheeses all the time. Mainly from their own flocks or herds. So that's raw cheese. So it hasn't been treated at all. Sometimes it's chilled down to 4 degrees just to preserve it a little bit longer, but then it's made into cheese straight away. Now, the invented by Louis Pasteur is pasteurisation. So milk can be pasteurised. It actually increases its life. It doesn't sour as quickly because what the pasteurisation process is that it alters the balance of the natural flora within the milk. So the lactic flora that's present within the milk, or the bacteria. So the milk is basically heated to around 72 degrees Celsius for 15 seconds, and that destroys all the active microbial flora, and as well as just about every other bacteria within the milk. So it kind of robs the milk of its true flavour. So with pasteurised milk, what we do to add the lactic flora back in again is use starters. We use a cheese starter, and that makes the flavour of the cheese. That gives the cheese the flavour that you're looking for. And there are, as we've mentioned in previous podcasts, different types of starter cultures. So it brings me on to something that's probably more common in Europe, and that's called microfiltered milk. So microfiltered milk is basically purified milk. And the process is that the cream is separated, so they skim the milk, so they keep the cream, and they pasteurise the cream, and then they pass the whey, or the skim milk liquid, and that's passed through an extremely fine membrane which captures the bacteria. Now, the reason they don't pass it all of it, including the cream, through the fine membrane is because the bacteria is the same size as the fat globules within the milk. So basically, it wouldn't go through at all. So that's what they do. And then they recombine it at the end. So what that does is apparently it preserves the milk's flavour. It tastes the same, even though the bacteria has been removed. And more about microfiltered milk later on during listener questions. So they're the main types of milk. Now, you're probably wondering why I haven't added in homogenisation. Now, homogenisation is something that it's not done to the milk per se to make it, to preserve its life. It's not done to make it safe or anything like that. The reason milk is homogenised, and this is from geekwise.com, is that any raw milk left to stand for a length of time, or pasteurised milk for that matter, is that the fat molecules typically float to the top. So obviously that gives you the cream line that you see on bottles of milk. And the longer it sits, the thicker the cream line. Really, I can't see the sense of homogenisation. There's no real reason for it to be homogenised. And basically the homogenisation process is that all of the milk after it's pasteurised is then passed through a filter, and it's agitated at high temperatures. And what happens is it breaks down the milk's fat molecules into smaller sizes. And basically, once they're broken down, it doesn't float to the top anymore, and these molecules stay suspended in the milk, and they resist the separation process. So it does lengthen the milk's shelf life a little bit. Pasteurisation does that much better. But like I said, there's no reason. So during cheese making, what we actually have to do is reverse the homogenisation process, because not only that, it actually breaks up the soluble calcium within the milk structure. So we have to add in calcium chloride in a diluted form. And what that does, it adds more soluble calcium to the milk after it's been homogenised. And the rennet actually then works a lot better. If you try and put rennet into homogenised milk at the same level in the recipes that I use, then you won't get a very strong curd. You won't be able to cut it properly. It'll be sloppy. It won't form properly during the heating process. So if you're going to use pasteurised and homogenised milk, then make sure that you add a weak calcium chloride solution, as suggested in most of my recipes if you look on littlegreencheese.com. So now there are different animals, as I mentioned, a goat, sheep, a cow, buffalo, that sort of thing. And these animals have different types of milk, so they have different properties. So the typical composition of milk from different animals, and we're more worried about the fat content of the milk, and this is what affects the cheese. Also, there is higher levels of calcium in some milk than there are others. So cows typically have around 3.9% fat within the milk. Goats have 3.5%. Sheep have a pretty high fat content, and that's about 6%. And water buffaloes, would you be surprised, have a fat content of 8% within their milk. So basically, the higher the fat content of the milk also equates roughly to the amount of calcium that's also in the milk. And with the lowest being goat's milk, only about 100 milligrams of calcium per 100 grams, and the highest being water buffalo, 195 milligrams per 100 grams. And as far as energy content go, obviously the more fat that's in the milk, the higher the energy content in kilojoules. So now with cow's milk, that can be broken down a little bit more. You can be with goat's milk and sheep as well, but typically the main milking cows throughout the world, so the Jersey cow, it has a milk fat percentage of about 5.2, which is really high for a cow. the Swiss Brown 4%, and the Holstein or Friesian cow about 3.6. And throughout Australia anyway, most of the commercial milking cows are Friesians. So the fat content is roughly around 3.6. That's pretty broad. It depends on the time of year, whether the cow's just calved. But their typical milk fat percentages. So that's everything you need to know about milk and how it's processed, and some of the things we can do as home cheese makers to make our milk usable in our own kitchens to make cheese. Well, this episode's news is quite good because it stems from Tasmania, the Bruny Island Cheese Co., which you might have seen if you've watched the Gourmet Farmer, which is a TV show on SBS, and within that show, along with Matthew Evans, is a guy called Nick Haddo, and he runs the Bruny Island Cheese Co. on Bruny Island. Funny about that, which is south of Hobart. Now they recently they've been named the 2013 Telstra Australian Business of the Year. I'll read a little bit about the article, and I'll put it into the show notes, the link. It's from foodmag.com.au, and it says that after working with specialist cheesemakers in Europe and Australia, Nick moved to Tasmania in 2001 to make cheese at the Finnegan Dairy Company before launching Bruny Island Cheese Co. in 2003. Haddo is an advocate and producer of raw milk cheese. I'm a traditionalist who recognises that great cheese was made for centuries before modern technology played a role, and I believe passionately in the old way of making, maturing and marketing cheese, he said. For me, cheese making is a pursuit of integrity, authenticity and flavour. There is no substitute for quality. We are only as good as the last batch of cheese we made. Great words from an equally great man. Well done, Nick, on winning the Business of the Year. So we're going to move on to listener questions now. This listener question is from Tangela. And Tangela says, just stumbled across your website. Thank you very much for sharing your knowledge. I recently have started my family on a journey of healthier choices. We are growing more food organically. We are buying raw milk, pasteurised eggs, chicken, and looking into pastured beef. I'm emailing to ask about cheese presses and moulds for hard cheeses. I have seen you made your own soap moulds. That is also something I want to get into, making your own soap, but for now we buy it from friends. So I was wondering if you make your own cheese press and what you used for a mould. Would love to see a video on that process, or have you done one and I just haven't seen it yet? Thanks for being a blessing, Tangela. Well, thank you very much, Tangela, for your email. I have not made my own cheese press, unfortunately, but there are many readers of the Little Green Cheese blog who have sent in pictures to me of their homemade cheese presses and their homemade moulds. I have actually bought a commercial press, and that came in kit form, and it came with a plastic mould, food-grade plastic mould with a plastic follower. But a lot of the readers that did send in those photos, you can have a look. So if you go to littlegreencheese.com and click on the label for cheese presses, you'll see that there are many different types of cheese presses that can be made at home. So hopefully that's answered your question. If I ever do get around to making my own cheese press, then I will most definitely make a video. And it sounds actually like a good challenge. And my son and I will probably attempt to make one in our next woodworking class. seeing the young lad is homeschooled. But thanks again, Tangela, for your question. And the next listener question comes from Jean-Michel in Nice in France. Over to you, Jean-Michel.
Hi Gavin, Jean-Michel speaking. I'm from the south of France and I'm trying to make cheese at home, partly thanks to you, so thank you. I recently was on holiday in Haute-Savoie and I went to a farm and I could watch them making cheese. They were making Tom de Savoie and they were making Tom de Savoie without any starters because they were using raw milk. So I had the opportunity to ask them questions about that. And they told me that starters were not necessary in raw milk because there were a lot of good bacteria in the raw milk. They were making cheese with raw milk just out from the cow, of course, so there was no problem. Here in France, in Nice, which is a city I can't get raw milk without driving 50 kilometers, which would be stupid ecologically. So I'm planning to use filtered milk, which hasn't been heated at all. And I was wondering if you had already tried to use this kind of milk to make cheese, and if starters were mandatory with this kind of milk, or if I could use filtered milk without starter. So I would like to have a bit of advice from you about this. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Well, no problems at all. Thanks very much, Jean-Michel, for your question. So, as I mentioned before, microfiltered milk is actually heat treated. The cream, as I said, is pasteurized. The whey is passed through the filters to get rid of the bacteria. Now, it's those bacteria that your friends that were making the cheese in the factory, it makes them not need to have, that's probably not the best way to say it, but not need a starter because all of the microbial flora is still present in the milk, and that will then acidify the milk and turn it into the wonderful cheese that the Tom Savoie is. So basically, if you're going to use a microfiltered milk, you will still need to add a starter culture that most semi-hard or hard cheeses recommend. So, don't skimp on the starter because most of the bacteria have been killed off during the microfiltration process. And we have another question from Jean-Michel. I'll just bring that up.
Gavin, Jean-Michel again. I would like to ask you another question following the previous one. If I use microfiltered milk instead of raw milk, maybe it would also or either eliminate the need of calcium chlorate, because microfiltered milk may eliminate the bacteria but not the calcium, because it's not heated. It's never heated when it's filtered. So what do you think of it? Also, thank you. Bye-bye. See you.
Once again, thanks, Jean-Michel, for a second question. You seem a bit of a star of the show. Maybe I need to interview you for the podcast. Anyway, hold that thought, mate. Yeah, so because microfiltered milk has not been homogenized and the fat globules within the microfiltered milk are still intact, you will not have to add calcium chloride solution to your milk. So that's fantastic news. You don't need to add that extra ingredient. So you should get a good curd structure and you should be able to cut it well and it will form a lovely cheese. So try that out. If you don't have any other choice, then microfiltered milk will give you no problems from what I have read on the net. Once again, I haven't used microfiltered milk before because it's not available here in Australia. It seems to be a European thing from what I've read. But some of the reliable sources on the net around cheese making in Europe recommend that you can use microfiltered milk, no problems at all, without having to add calcium chloride. But once again, you do need to add that starter culture. Well, that's all we've got for this episode, Curd Nerds. Thanks very much for listening. Now, you can find upcoming cheese course workshop dates on littlegreencheese.com. You can just click on the tab there. You can also find all my recipes. You can find all the YouTube videos and much, much more. You can also find my ebook, Keep Calm and Make Cheese, The Beginner's Guide to Cheese Making at Home. And that's available in all ebook formats. You can buy it directly from the site on PDF as well. So stay tuned for the next exciting episode of the Little Green Cheese Podcast. During this podcast, you heard royalty-free music by Kevin MacLeod. I played Malt Shop Bop, News Theme, and Call to the Dairy Cows.